Cisco, I love this news. This is interesting. Sometimes the press goes a little overboard, but Cisco introduces new metrics to showcase their shift towards software. Like, okay, well, you read the article and it says they're going to start reporting annual recurring revenue and subscriptions as a percentage of total revenue. This is it's not groundbreaking by any stretch of the imagination, but kudos to Cisco trying to adapt. These are actually non-GAAP metrics, but they do gives you some understanding of how a subscription business is running. So I wanted to talk a little bit about metrics today. What is one GAAP metric and one non-GAAP metric you like, and why? Toby, you're up first.
You know what I'm going to say, right? Like, you know what I love.
Not stock-based compensation.
Well, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that, actually. I like operating cash flow, specifically operating cash flow, right? So, this is the GAAP metric. There are rules on how you calculate that, and you see it in the cash flow statement. It's right there, plain as day. You don't have to work hard to see what is the operating cash flow. You can play with earnings a little bit, legitimately. I'm not saying there's anything untoward, but when you're looking at earnings, when you're calculating earnings, a lot of that comes from when is revenue recognized. There's a lot of, I don't necessarily want to say guesswork, but that's true to some extent that goes into that, right? What is your trigger going to be? Like, how are you going to say when a contract is 80% completed versus 70% completed? Like, how do you just figure out what number you're going to put on there? So there's some give and take on earnings, but cash, I mean, you have your cash balance at the beginning of the period, you have it at the end. It's kind of night and day, right? As long as you're keeping your books properly. So that's a very hard number. And it's at what you actually collected. It's the cash you actually brought in versus the revenue that you earned based on whatever accounting rules and adjustments you're going with. If you're trying to grow your business, if you're trying to run your business, if you're trying to pay your bills, pay your employees, you do that with cash, right? You can't do that with earnings. Like, it's got to be cash. So when I look at operating cash flow, one reason I like the operating version, right? Because it tells me whether the company is making money from their actual business, their operating part of their business, and whether they can sustain both their expenses and their growth, their operating expenses and their growth expenses from the cash they generate. If you see positive operating cash flow, ignoring for the moment financing cash flow and investing cash flow, that's a very good indication that the business is self-sustaining, that they can fund themselves out of operations, and that is fantastic. You don't have to rely on external financing to do what you need to do. You love to see that. For the non-GAAP side of things, I would say I kind of use an adjusted version of those operating earnings, or I like to. You can pull out some things that might be propping up cash flow, but are still very real business expenses that you might not want to factor into that calculation for whatever reason. Maybe it's actually a version of free cash flow, but maybe I calculate it a little bit different than some people do. But the one key item we're talking about there is stock-based comp, Brian, as you alluded to. Technically,
it's Toby's operational cash flow.
It's my version of operating cash flow, right? And here's my justification for it, right? Like, yes, stock-based comp is absolutely a non-cash expense, for sure, and the employees know that because they're getting stock, not cash. But it takes value from shareholders. You're diluting shareholder value in order to preserve cash. And when you really think about what's going on functionally, I think you could logically put stock-based comp into financing cash flow instead of operating cash flow, because what you are functionally doing is financing your business by selling stock to your employees. They are taking that stock in lieu of the salary that you would give them. They're taking that as part of their salary. So that's really what you're doing, getting financing from your employees and from their labor. So I think it really more logically to me belongs in financing cash flow, but GAAP tells us it's part of operating cash flow. So there you go. The other reason I like to kind of take it out is because you can do a thought experiment. You can say, all right, let's pretend I wasn't a public company. Let's pretend I was private. Let's pretend I was 100% owned by someone else. what does that business look like then? Well, without publicly traded stock, without any kind of stock at all, you're going to have to pay those employees in cash, right? And so that non-cash number suddenly becomes a cash number, all things equal. And if that's your scenario, if you weren't public, like if you didn't have the public markets to help you out, could you still run this business sustainably? And if the only reason you're operating cash flow positive is because you're paying a lot of compensation in stock, my suggestion is no, you can't, not sustainably for the long term. You're going to need something else. So that's just kind of what I like. One thing I like to do is to take that operating cash flow and say, let's take a step back and see whether this is actually making money from an overall business standpoint. And sometimes it still is, right? Sometimes you can see companies with really big non-cash or stock-based comp numbers and still have positive operating cash flow. And then you want to say, okay, good on you. Those subscription businesses that we've done a lot of deep dives on are good examples of that, because they bring in a lot of massive cash up front that never gets counted. It is not immediately credited to revenue. It becomes deferred revenue, but they have the cash on hand and they can use it to grow. They can use it to operate their business. And I love those kind of companies.
Yeah, Toby, when you were explaining your non-GAAP metric and whether companies can actually afford their stock-based compensation, it reminds me, Susie Orman used to have a show on, and it used to be people would come on and go, "Can I afford it?" And I could see this, young upstart CEO going on the Susie Orman show and says, "I want to pay my employees stock-based compensation." Susie Orman grill him about whether he could actually afford it or not, and what's his cash flow and all that. So,
yeah, and to be fair, using stock-based comp is totally legitimate. And it's the way things are done in Silicon Valley. And a lot of employees want that, right? It allows the employees to become owners of the business, right? And to participate in that upside from a high growth business. So I don't want to say, it's not like I'm saying I never want to see that. I just think that when you do see it, especially if it's a large number, pull it out and see what it looks like without that. And you get a better sense of what the operations are doing. I do like having employee owners. I think that's awesome. I just wish it wasn't thrown into operating cash flow.
Excellent. So Nick, what are metrics that you like?
I'm with Toby. I love the free cash flow metric related to operating cash flow. I love it though, because it only factors for the actual operating profit. It excludes all the non-cash stuff. But you also get a good picture of like capital expenditures, like property, plant, equipment that a company is spending on. So it can be kind of lumpy sometimes, like it's up and down a lot, but it's real profit for the business. So I love that one. But it was interesting. Cisco said it's going to start reporting this ARR, this annualized recurring revenue. I think that's a really interesting non-GAAP metric to keep tabs on. There's a lot of companies besides just Cisco that are reporting that now, and specifically like some of these legacy tech companies that are now suddenly a little bit behind the curve. They're like trying to make their own transition to the cloud, along with every other business out there in the economy. And as they do so, that ARR figure can be really helpful in determining if the company is really growing or not. I think a couple of weeks ago, I talked with Jason about Splunk. It's in a similar boat. And if you're only looking at revenue and a company is transitioning to like a subscription business or a cloud business, it can like give this effect that like, well, the company's suddenly shrinking in size. But it's because like as the old term revenue that they can collect and then realize upfront, that phases out. And then, the new contract with the customer becomes a cloud-based one where you can collect the revenue, but you can't report it as revenue until you deliver the service. So ARR kind of like takes both the term and the cloud revenue on an annualized basis, combines it together, and it gives you like a more true sense of what the actual revenue trajectory is for the business. So I think that's a great one to keep an eye on for companies that are undergoing a similar migration like Cisco is.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few companies that are doing that. I know Alteryx is one, Atlassian, just to name two stocks that begin with A that use ARR. Great. Let me wrap up mine. I mean, the kind of, to be boring, revenue growth, top line revenue growth. Love it. The bigger the number, the better. The other piece is where that revenue is coming from. If you're a company like iRobot, you have to sell a certain number of robot vacuum cleaners every quarter. And once you sold one, that revenue disappears and you have to go earn that revenue again. So I very much like companies that sort of have a steady stream of revenue coming in, either subscriptions, or a lot of times things like e-commerce isn't necessarily recurring revenue, but once you get people hooked, they're buying things from you again and again, and so you get that repeat factor. And it's not like you're buying a vacuum cleaner every month, right? You're buying different things. So revenue growth is kind of my favorite. From a non-GAAP perspective, remaining performance obligations. So this is one that's around software and any companies that have contracts. So remaining performance obligations, basically is if I have a 12-month contract and I've already completed 2 months of that, 10 months of the value of that 12-month contract is remaining performance obligations. I may have been paid up front for it, or I may not have. The cash flow is completely different, but this is just sort of what customers are on the hook to you for. And I love it when that number grows, because then customers are signing longer and or larger contracts, and that just says that there's more growth to come as the company gets into those larger and longer contracts. So those are two metrics that I like.